Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. As I'd like to say, thank you for showing up for each other here at the DX Alliance. That's what we're all about around the region. And yeah, so I thank you. I thank you for that. In some recent news, I will say as well that one of my colleagues at the DX Alliance just posted recently about some NPM. That's NuGet Packet Manager. Is that right? If I remember my acronyms correctly.
Node package
Vulnerability.
manager?
Node Package
Yeah,
Manager.
node
Thank
package
you.
manager. Yeah, yeah.
Node Package Manager vulnerabilities that have snuck into the old digital supply chain. And raise that as just one of the things that we need to be aware of as we start going with this AI guided development cycle that we are in. There are so many things that could potentially go wrong that we need to be cognizant of. And we're so glad to hear today to have with me my brother in arms at the DX Alliance, Jovan Allene, fellow Dominican, with us in part two. When we spoke the last time, we didn't quite get to talk about his AI workflows and how things have changed over the years. Jovan's been doing software engineering for how long, Jovan, now?
25 years, I guess. Just
Yeah.
about. We're in 2026. Yeah, just about 25 years.
Yes, yeah. So right around the same time I was getting into it professionally myself, and in that period of time, oh my God, so much has changed. So much has changed. When we were getting started, and interestingly enough, Jovan started on the kind of more graphical side as well as I did, and there was things like Macromedia, Flash, and things that we used to toy around with, and you teach yourself VB, Visual Basic, and all of these sorts of things, and you figured it out. But now there's so many tools that are available to us, and so many of the things that we started out with. Like, how many of you, how many of you in school would have calculated things like square roots and cube roots by hand back in the day when you were doing mathematics in school? There you
Oh
go,
yeah.
David.
We weren't even allowed to have a calculator in the class.
Do you all remember the hubbubaloo when scientific calculators came out? And everybody was like, okay,
This stuff
scientific
was
calculators.
this stuff was so fascinating. I got an HP 35 calculator about 4 months after it first came out. I was in
Yeah.
engineering school at the time, and everybody was just fascinated. You could push a button, and there was the cosine of zero point
Yeah.
0.3 to
Yeah.
12 digits, like instantly, almost instantly. And they
Yeah.
keep pushing that button. It's like, how do they do that? How do they do that?
How
And
do they?
then the university got a little bit annoyed. They said, we can't take that into an exam. How often
Mhm.
do you actually have to do a cosine of anything in an exam, really? So it's quite needed it for doing problem sets and whatnot, but not for actual exams. It's just fascinating when that came out. It's just fascinating.
It was incredible. And I was on my way to study computer science and mathematics in Waterloo when scientific calculators came out. And I remember exactly that. You're not being allowed to take them into class. They're not being allowed in exams, all kinds of things like that. And today it's just another tool. And the problem set, though, has increased. More is demanded of you because you can calculate the cosine of 3 with the push of a button. You can graph things, and now they're requiring more of you. But mathematics has not gone away as a profession as a result of scientific calculators. And a matter of fact, it has only gotten to be more fascinating. And right now in software, when Jovan and I and many of you would have started, we were getting into some very more low-level code, and now we have some more advanced tools. And I dare say that my opinion is software engineering is not going away because of it either. But it most definitely has changed. It's changed a great deal. And it has changed in the last few months in ways that are both inspiring and disturbing. So we're going to unpack a little bit of that with Mr. Allene today. I'm going to mostly sit and ask useful idiot questions to Jovan as we go along through this process. But I wonder, Jovan, if you might just talk to us, give us a little bit of an overview of the journey and now how it has changed with AI in your workflow. Maybe you want to start out with telling us how you were building solutions before, how you've managed small
Sure.
teams, built complex solutions, and then How have you been building solutions before, and how are you perhaps emulating some of that with the new tools that are available to us?
Sure, sure. Thanks for that, Dennis. And yeah, I think we have come a long way, and I'll maybe start with just a little bit of context setting, and then we'll keep it a bit dynamic. I'd love to hear from everybody what tools they use and what their familiarity is. But ultimately, to your point on the scientific calculator, we came from manuals, books, having to read up an entire spec document for maybe weeks at a time. I remember I was working on a project once with an agency, and they gave us 2 weeks. Anybody who started, they got 2 weeks just to read the documentation for the CMS, and that was straight up just 2 weeks, just sitting at your desk reading the documentation from end to end. Along the way, we got Stack Overflow, we got peer question and answer, we got different tools. Then Google really got really good at surfacing the right responses to your question. So I think one of my skills that I really honed was how do you talk to Google? How do you do the proper queries before they were prompts, get results? So we've seen that evolution. Now we don't really need to leave our IDE and our development environment, our building system, however you phrase it. So that has absolutely changed in the idea that you had to cram and pack your context window, your own personal context window, with all the knowledge you could up front, and now you're grasping it in real time, and you have a system that could go out and retrieve it for you in real time. So that aspect of it has changed, but I think what hasn't changed is the software development loop that we go through. And it's evolved, but it really hasn't changed. We can go through it a lot quicker. And that really, I think, is a superpower. And we can go through it with, I think, what used to be a lot of collaboration. Not that collaboration is bad, but collaboration is a core part of engineering and software development and still continues to be. But there's a lot of research roles and a lot of roles that were dedicated to just finding and deciding on information, right? Defining your spec. And Agile took us from waterfall, where we spent a year defining the spec, another 6 months giving it to a developer to read, and then another 2 years to engineer that actual solution, when that cycle can happen within a day right now, or even less. So it's been an evolution of speed, but I think with that an evolution of complexity as well. So wrangling that is the key challenge nowadays.
Absolutely. You talked about the evolution of complexity, and when we would have begun, I think it would have been much more common in, I don't know, whatever, 25, I guess 2000s, for there to be very small teams, one person teams building a solution. You have a problem, you call a developer, you're done, kind of sort of thing. Now we're having much more dynamic, much more larger teams as the complexity has increased. So let's talk about the why did we start to break up that have a problem, call a developer, and they build something for you thing into all of these different disciplines? And what were the disciplines that helped you to build those more complex solutions as we got along? Why did they get more complex? What roles did you need in order to get it done? And what was the reason for that? And then we can get into like, how do you now, because right now we're hearing that people can go and somebody can vibe code an entire enterprise platform system and without having to have all of these teams. And is that something that's true, or something that maybe is a little bit overhyped?
Yeah, you touched on quite a few things there. So I'll start with maybe the evolution, because I think when we talk about the complexities and what has changed, we hit a point, I guess, where open source really took off, and we started, just like the Industrial Revolution, we started getting to a point in time where a lot of the common tools were already abstracted, were already built. So that by itself meant that we could build more complex solutions, and the easier problems were already solved. So I think that's one bar that raised complexity, or one kind of moment in time that raised complexity, and I would reference that as the jQuery era, right? Where we got that big abstract library that allowed us to not have to worry about each individual browser's nuances and challenges. And we were in a less standardized environment. So one library like that really helped. It's like having a screwdriver, Phillips screwdriver, right? Instead of everybody having their own type of screw, everybody standardized around a Phillips screwdriver and we could all assemble things a lot faster. So that was a big part where complexity started to sprawl. And with that, not to say that we weren't developing complex solutions before, but with that, I think you got a lot more accessible large teams. And those teams, we had the evolution where we broke teams up by function. So you'd have software engineers, you'd have designers, you'd have QA folks, and all of those on different teams working in a sort of assembly line. And I think we quickly found out that wasn't the most collaborative way to create good solutions, at least. You could get
Mm-hmm.
solutions, but not the most productive way to build good ones. So we went through that evolution. And I think what we're looking at right now, and where the last 10 years I've spent really focusing on, is domain-driven design and driven teams that really align software functions with the value that they deliver and the business function that they are aligned to.
Unpack that for me just a little bit. Like a domain. So, what are these different sort of domains that you'd be talking about?
Yeah, so if you think about any business, right, let's maybe choose something straightforward enough, like tourism, right? You think through the business and the customer journey, particularly, and you may think you have reservations, you have check-in, you have check-out in terms of the room stay, and then you have an on hotel experience or
Mm-hmm.
on island experience. So each of these business domains and each of them may have their own individual challenges that the customer is facing or that the internal operations team themselves might be facing. So
Mm-hmm.
those end up being the business domains or the domains that are typically best suited to align software around. And every company would want to define their own domains. Obviously, there's standards for banking and other more
Mm-hmm.
mature institutions or industries. But ultimately, you align your teams around the problems that they're trying to solve and you make them fully functional. I touched earlier on the idea of a design team, a development team, a QA team. In
Mm-hmm.
this approach, you're pulling everybody together, one designer, one a handful of developers, one QA person, and they're responsible end to end for the business problem definition, business requirement
Mm.
definition, and then all the way to releasing that software and maintaining it for a customer. It's like a end to end rather than your kind of assembly line approach that you might see in a car factory. And we modeled a lot from manufacturing in the past, but software is a bit more dynamic.
Right on. So then you're ending up with some of those similar roles, but they're focused on something like that checkout payment process, and then therefore there's going to be much more demand for everybody in that more focused team to understand the business problem than
Correct.
there would have been just in the past, just the technical part, and then having somebody try to figure it out in their head. So that team embodies that knowledge as well.
Absolutely. And that's the
Okay.
key is that team can now relate to the customer. They can really understand what the business problems are, not just put their heads down and be technologists. They really have to apply that technology to the business and to the customer problems. So I think as we tie it into to where we are now, that model and thinking about giving your workflow knowledge of that model becomes a bit more compressed where we can do that in a larger cycle or in a
Right.
faster cycle.
I think, Jovan, that's where now, like you mentioned, we had things like different libraries that helped us accelerate things and whatnot. But now with these large language models, we're able to also provide some of that domain context to our AI agents? And how are you actually making that transition now? So now that we've led teams, both of us throughout the career. If you were, what would your typical team when you were working at places like Flash Food or whatever else you've done? What would your typical team perhaps would have looked like in the past? And if you had a blank slate today, how would you be? And by the way, you do have a blank slate today because I know we are rethinking some of that as we build
Yes.
on Psalm as well. With that blank slate, how did those teams differ now?
So it's ironic because I had a conversation similarly to this a few weeks ago with an agency who asked me a similar question, how I change that structure. And frankly, I wouldn't change the structure itself a whole lot right now because AI is not meant to replace, as that's the myth I'll probably touch on, is that AI is not
Yeah,
meant to replace the people. AI is meant to augment the people. Just a hammer doesn't replace the carpenter
yeah,
or
yeah.
the mason. A hammer augments and makes them that much quicker, that much more precise. So the team
Hmm.
structure themselves, I would maintain that domain-centric, customer-centric approach. But where we measured things and how I approach things, particularly, let's say at Flash Food, which was a double-sided marketplace, we we really wanted to give everybody again the ability to own a feature. One team owns something end
Hmm.
to end. If something goes wrong, you're not calling an operations team who has no idea what the function of the software is. So I would say as we measured complexity in those scenarios, then we are able to take on more complexity right now because a developer doesn't have to remember in their head the nuanced decision that was made for one line of code. And I would challenge any of us, and I had to go through this over the years myself, in that it's an art that we used to be very proud of, right? How cleanly could we write a function or a piece of code so that the next developer could understand it really easily? There
Yeah.
is no, that's the myth that is not a myth. There is no value in you writing lines of code anymore, right? Those
Whoa, whoa,
lines of
whoa.
code, those lines, and I say that from a readability and aesthetic perspective, right?
Yeah.
Those lines of code will be written by an AI, by an LLM, way cleaner, way faster, with better documentation, with a better function signature than you would have in the time that you would spend, right? But where the value is in knowing how large to make those methods, how to name them, how to put them together so that there is a cohesive design pattern and
Mm.
sort of structure to the application, that there's not to break it down to a construction metaphor, which I find is always very relevant, that you don't have a bathroom right next to another bathroom on the same floor, right? Or
Hmm.
you don't have a bathtub, but you have a swinging door that doesn't make sense on a bathtub, right? Those
Mm.
pieces that you put together are where your value is, and the decisions that you make as a software engineer now really come to light, right? Because every prompt you give, and if you're not specific enough, it'll make new decisions, right? And
Yeah.
it's what you call an undeterministic system, right? It will use probability to decide, okay, in this scenario, how do I best fill in these gaps? So a lot of what we're talking about now is what's referred to as context engineering. And in the past and in teams, you had humans managing context on an individual level, and your brain becomes your context store. Now, this is where we've been spending quite a bit of the time reevaluating things, is how do you manage that context in the software and in the IDE, the development environment that you're working with, so that the AI system
Mm.
itself has access to that context to make the right decisions when you don't fill in the right gaps.
As you say that, all of us remember when we started to have the personal computer all those of us who are old enough, personal computer revolution. Some people were saying, okay, now we're going to have this paperless, paperless world, right? We're going to, and we somehow ended up with more paper. It was not because it was easier to produce the paper, and then the complexity
Mhm.
of the business just got greater. And I wonder if, in some ways as well, that now that we're able to not have to spend so much time writing that line of code. And by the way, as somebody for a good deal of my entrepreneurial journey, I've been selling lines of code for dollars. I think that also demands a rethink of the business model and what customers' expectations will be with regards to what they are paying for. Are they paying for lines of code, or are they paying for that domain expertise as well? Is that's another thing I think we have to unpack in terms of what the people's value is now in this. Is it fair to say that now that it's easier for individuals to write a line of code, that what we can expect is perhaps much more software than we've ever seen before?
Oh,
And much
yes,
more complex software.
you've seen it already. It's a proliferation of software and software startups over the last 2 years, right? But with that power comes what's the right software to build. And I think that's why you've seen so many people, and we talked about OpenCode earlier, you've seen lots of people experimenting and not knowing how to take that experiment further or what to actually build, because a lot of the problems are already solved, right? Especially when you think about the developed countries, the global north in the opposition of the global south. A lot of software is already productized. And Microsoft, I think, started this journey about 20 years ago with their everything
Yeah.
will be a service, right? So everything ended up being online. We have everything accessible through a browser now. So lots of software has been built. So I think with the capability of just being able to produce lines of code, it's what are you building for and why build something that may already exist? And yeah, with that, I think it opens us up to build more complex, to solve more complex problems.
Yes, I'm very much a big picture person. I try to be in the DX Alliance as well, and I want to leave some time for you to get a little bit more nitty gritty in terms of the things that how you're going about it. I know that's something that John wants to see as well, but I will just end with this. Some time ago, and shout out to a friend in the digital experience space who used to be an advocate over at Optimizely, a man by the name of Dan Barker, who's put me onto a book some time ago called Humans Are Underrated. And I would just say that as we make this transition into this AI code, in AI age, when it's easier to do lines of code, I think what my takeaway from this first bit of this conversation today is that we still need humans in the loop and not even more humans who understand the context of other human beings and how they want to live and use these solutions. And that's where it's going to be, the opportunities will be. So in terms of if you're an up and coming developer, you might be worried about there being fewer jobs to write those lines of code. But as we've already established, there's probably going to be many more pieces of software out there that need humans in the loop. And where your value is going to be is to be that person who understands how the other people are going to use it and how it will interact with the world to deliver value. But I'll leave that with you, Jovan, and also just let us take a little look under your hood with your own process. Practically speaking, we've talked about the high level. How are you turning that? What are the bricks and pipes and pieces that you're using to create some of your solutions today?
Sure. And I'll just close off what you just mentioned in the sense that now we have the ability to solve way larger problems. So get more creative, look at harder problems to solve. So instead of trying to cut the workforce, we should be becoming more ambitious in our endeavors because we have this capability. And Jensen Wong from NVIDIA said this recently as well. Any company who's firing a bunch of employees is really just lacking imagination because they don't know
Mm-hmm.
what to do with the extra power that they've been given. But I see we have a hand
Right.
up from Mary. So I'll take a pause there and then we'll chat with Mary quickly. And then I'd love to hear from everybody what their AI tools are and what they're using currently.
Go ahead, Mary.
Yeah, my question was about security. It seems to me with various random people using AI, and AI is already very prone to various security matters that one seems to need layers and layers of, I would argue, one needs layers and layers of more security to combat all the people who are probably misusing. So I'm just wondering about that as a factor. Or
Yeah,
something that all firms should be doing, worrying more and more about security.
absolutely. Security is more paramount now than ever, and I'll touch on it from two fronts. And Dennis, you actually started the conversation with this, with the NPM and the Python LLM, light LLM vulnerabilities and supply chain challenges that have come on out. So one, Mary and everybody else, I think this is now attackers have access to way more sophisticated tools that they can use to breach systems, to gain access. So those are not going away. They're getting more powerful. You have almost nation state level capabilities in the hands of script kiddies, as they may have been
Yeah.
put before, or vibe coders as they're probably more called now. So your traditional security practices you should keep in mind. You should always think about that, and that's not putting sensitive information into your LLMs. John touched on local LLMs. I think that is a great way to safeguard yourself a little bit, but we have a lot of work to do in terms of hardware accessibility and model performance before that can be a really accessible thing. But think about your hygiene, right? Don't put sensitive information into prompts. Protect your access keys to the kingdom. There's standard places and practices like .env files and so on for those writing software where most coding agents will be at least semi-aware not to read these files as sensitive files, but there's custom solutions that are coming out as well that kind of broker access to these credentials. But you're seeing those kind of vulnerabilities on a daily basis, and people are excited to try software. OpenClaw is a good example of that, where for the first 2 weeks can count number of exposures that happen because people just installed a piece of software on a computer, made it publicly available, and all of a sudden all of their Google email keys, their calendar keys, all of that was available just because it was given. So long story short, yes, invest in security. If you're an enterprise or an organization, think about how you secure your systems and think about how you secure your endpoints, which are the machines and the laptops and the computers that your employees are using. And there's standard ways of doing that, and those have become even more important now for data exfiltration and things like that. Hopefully that answered your question, Mary.
It did. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Wonderful. I'll encourage everybody to do what Mary just did. Throw your hand up at any point in time, and Jovan and I will try to catch it, and so that we can have a more interactive session on this. And Jovan, if you have specific questions for the people in terms of what they're doing and for that, what they want to see, you absolutely go ahead and drive that as you
Yeah,
go
I was
along.
just gonna jump into that a little bit
Yeah.
because I think it'll set some context for what we go through as a practical walkthrough. So maybe I'll call on Ken because I know he's deep in the weeds as well. What tools are we using? And this is a group question, so anybody who feels answering afterwards or as well, definitely just shoot your hand up. Would love to hear what tools people are using, from the Geminis to the Claude desktops and everything in between. So maybe Ken, I can call you out first. I know you and I started some of this conversation last week.
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me?
Hey, yes,
Yep.
we can.
Yeah, I just use in-IDE VS Code,
Okay.
and I tend to use DeepSeek because it's cheap and it's more granular. I gotta update context every move I make, so the LLM does get a lot of context from my setup. And I
From
just
your code base or from your directory structure and your environment?
from the code base, correct?
Okay.
Or whatever I'm working on, it'll get that context.
Okay. Okay, awesome. So you're talking about client in VS Code and open source models.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. I'll touch on a few things on that for sure.
Okay.
Anybody else?
On my side, Jovan, I've been using some of the Gemini and Claude models in VS Code
Okay.
predominantly
Yeah.
for the actual coding, and I've enjoyed. I started out, and it was nice to hear from you that you're doing some of that kind of more spec-driven stuff, because I've started some of my recent projects just deciding some architectural decision artifacts and having a Copilot file that tells it to check these things for everything that I do and stop me from doing some things that might be stupid, which I've checked first by telling it to do other things, and it's managed to do some of that. But that's been my general pattern. My go-to has been Gemini. I think the Gemini models as of late have gotten really good, although to Kent's point, they are a little bit more pricey per call. But Claude, Opus, and Gemini is what I've been using a lot of.
Awesome, awesome, cool, cool. Yeah, and I think
I
there's some
use,
commonalities there. Sorry, go ahead,
Yeah,
David.
David.
yeah, I use a lot of what Dennis said, Gemini, and I use anti-gravity a lot.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, I do a little bit of vibe coding with the Lovable.
Nice. Yeah, Lovable has become a really an accessible platform.
Yeah,
Prompt and forget. It's
yeah,
amazing the
exactly.
kind of stuff you can pull up.
I speak the words and it happens, man.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, Lovable is definitely on that extreme end of vibe coding where
Yeah,
you give it a prompt and it gives you something that is fully functional with a backend, a database, web sockets, and the works.
exactly. And you upload that to GitHub and I can download it into my server with anti-gravity, and yeah, it works out well.
Nice, nice. Okay.
What guardrails would you put around some of these things, Jovan, if you were just starting out
Oh,
something?
that's a damn good
Uh,
question.
yeah, yeah. And Jovan, yeah, what kind of guardrails you thinking about, like, for you suggest for us, and as we start these kinds of projects?
Yeah, so I think I go back to the traditional enterprise. I spend a lot of time building compliant software and things that had to go through audits, SOC 2 audits, PCI compliance, and so on and so forth. So you go back to the typical guardrails that you would in any proper software process, and that's testing. Make sure you set up your test suites and you set up your quality assurance layer. And there's something called a test triangle which the more engineering folks on the call might understand or should understand, where you write a certain number of tests and they operate on different parts of the system. So do your testing, build testing into your prompts, right? If you can. Lovable, I'll be transparent. I haven't used it too much. I did one trivia experiment with it one night and I was amazed at how it brought that up, but I haven't gone beyond trying to bring that into a repo like David has. But David, once you start bringing that into your own environments, then yes, make sure you're adding tests and you're doing security scans on there. So there's tools that can do security scanning, static security scanning on your code base, dynamic security scans, things like Sonar Cube, and even GitHub Advanced Security. If you have paid GitHub accounts, those things help you scan your software and scan what's produced. So they'll help find issues. If you're in GitHub, Copilot does a pretty good job. If you submit code into what's called a pull request or peer review, it will call out certain issues for you. So those things will help for sure. And as I said, scanning and running experimentation. You can also get into agents. I have a colleague who is a CISO, great guy. He's built over the last couple of years a suite of security agents, and he will deploy that against a code base and give you a list of vulnerabilities, right? So if you are taking anything to production from a vibe coding session, then those types of processes are helpful from somebody experienced. That'll help you protect your software. But something that's been launched on Lovable where you're not taking people's personal information and capturing any sensitive information, you can probably get away with skipping some of that complexity, but anything you're taking sensitive data into, I would say run at least some of these processes.
Jovan, I wonder how I've heard you mentioned agents, and I think you've talked in the past with me about multi-agent or multi kind of
Mhm.
session workflows. How do you practically set up that so that you have these virtual agents working on your team? How would you actually make things like that happen? And what kind of context or instructions do you have to give them to set it up? What sort of tools would you use?
That is a great question, Dennis, because so I'll break it down into two parts. You have your models that you talk to, and that's things like Gemini, where you get access to, you go onto Google's platform, gemini.google.com, or Google's AI mode, or one of these where you're talking directly to an LLM. That's just an LLM that you're speaking with, right? And in the grand scheme of things, that only gets you a certain bar of quality. You might connect a tool to an LLM and that'll allow it to do web search, and that allows it to bring in context and bring in information from outside. But anytime you really are getting into production grade and really enterprise level type of development with AI, you really are looking at a multi-agent system. And there's a ton of white papers out there that anybody who's interested can do some research on the difference between the power of an agentic approach versus just a straight LLM. But really, an agent is a definition of persona combined with a set of tools and its own context and memory, right? If you combine more than one of those, you end up with a multi-agent system where you typically have one LLM that's orchestrating, acting like the project manager or acting as the human interface, and that system or that LLM can decide to interact with other AI systems or other AIs. And in a loop, they act like a company where one person can collaborate with another, can share information with another, ask information from another. And as they go through that process iteratively, they're proven to correct their own mistakes and ultimately find solutions to more complex problems.
Oh, wicked.
So
Wicked.
that's really what
I
an
don't
agent is.
help me here. I don't know if there's any, whether it's your stuff or whether it's any kind of diagrams or anything that I'm putting you on the spot. And
Yeah.
if you don't have anything, I'll take it out of the video and replay. But is there anything that we can see to better able to understand how that kind of a setup actually works in a system?
Sure. There's in terms of the visuals, I'm just trying to pull something up quickly. And Anthropic had a pretty good, where is it? A pretty good document that they had put up not too long ago, last year at some point. Hopefully I can find it. But it really, a lot of it depends on the tool that you're using or the system that you're using to interface. So a lot of people nowadays use Claude Desktop. So
Yeah.
that has the concept of agents and skills. So agents again are the definition of persona you'd like an LLM to an AI system to take on, and skills are what you would train it with. So if I share my screen here really quickly, if I can find the screen share. Think everybody can see my screen?
Not yet.
To hit one more button.
Yep. There you go.
Okay,
There
perfect.
you go. Nice.
Use my million tabs.
Oh my
So this
God.
is an example of what a basic LLM would look like, and that's your Gemini or your basic chat GPT interface, right? Where you make a call, it goes into the LLM, that LLM will query some search results, and that's where you might see Google search happening or some external piece of information being cited. That happens, then sometimes that gets a tool call if you're integrating with your email in Gemini or some other external system in Claude, and then you read and write to your memory. And memory is basically the chat messages, right, that you send back and forth. And that's a basic process. So you go in and you come out with a response. It ends after that. Now, these get a little bit more complex where you have a specific workflow you want to follow. And this is, let's say, if you're defining a specific process, right? And you know you want a booking to happen, then you want a room reservation to be made, then an email to be sent. But let's just theorize that you want an AI to do that. Then you would build a more static workflow like that that would encompass more than one AI system. But then you may end up in these more complicated scenarios or more sophisticated scenarios where in this one it's more of a consensus system. So you send the same problem to three different AIs. So you might try it with Quen, you might try it with Claude, you might try it with Google, and then you aggregate and decide which one is the best result. And then, so that's what I just explained here. Then you can synthesize that into a final result. But this is ultimately the loop that we talked about, right?
Mm.
Something goes in, it generates a request, something evaluates that request and decides if it should take another turn at it. And that can go on for a few iterations, it can go on for hours, it can go on for really as long as you are willing to pay budget and the system thinks that it still needs to work on the problem. And then this is a similar sort of scenario visualization, but that just comes back to the human for decision. So all that to say that there's different ways to put these out, and that's where a lot of research labs are focused on right now is what's the perfect combination of these workflows. There's swarms, there's 100 papers out there on experimentation on different ways to combine these LLM systems together. But ultimately, for I think this group, your Claude code and your Visual Studio Code allow you, and I'll open a project here quickly, allow you to define that in your own code base. So this is really what Visual Studio Code looks like. You have a set of agents you can define. Most systems will have a generic agent, an ask, which is a simple way of saying, I give it a prompt, come back with a response. Don't try to do anything with it, just come back with a response. Planning is super important because it allows you to research and output context, make a decision on what you want the LLM to do, and then that comes back with a text plan that then you can switch to agent mode and execute on that plan. Back to where we started early on, the software development lifecycle process. You have a project manager, a product manager who may define specifications for you, or be a business analyst. Those people define your specifications. They may consult with you as an engineer for some technical decisions. That's really what plan mode is. And then when as a team or as a developer, you've decided that plan is good enough, then you switch to what is the developer, the software engineer agent, right? And that can execute on that plan and create. And I think they've named it plan and agent because these aren't specific to software engineering. You can come in here as a business person and ask totally non-technical questions and have a plan and an agent put out a document for you. Search the internet, do some research, and put out a document for you. And then you can define your own. So each of these tools will allow you to define your own custom agents. And these are really just, they are markdown files. So I can choose what type of agent, a Claude agent or a Copilot agent. So if I go with Copilot, I can say, we can create a quick custom agent. Oh, let's go researcher. All right, so that gives me a markdown file, and this one is blank, and I have it in my preview mode. But ultimately, it's if everybody should be at least these days familiar with Markdown, it's a simple text file where you define some key sections, and that allows it to operate. Now, you'll see that here, you'll see that show up here, and you can, oh, this is a good example. So this one is complete. This one is a built-in agent. So in this case, it says you are planner and implementer of .NET 10, MCP. You give it some core capabilities, some guidelines, output expectation, any useful snippets, a checklist before finishing. And you really give it context. And that's really what you're trying to mimic with an agent is what would your teammate that you work with know, and what are the inputs and outputs you would expect from that teammate so that you can take that work and take it on afterwards. So this one is a pretty long one, but it has code samples as examples and a lot of information. So ultimately, this agent might decide based on what it's doing to use one of these, some of these, or multiple of these, and they appeared with these models. Right, so this is the suite of models, and I'm a big fan of VS Code Copilot. I think price for variability, they do pretty well in that they give you, for I think $40 a month as the base plan, you get access to models from most of the different providers, if not all. Plus you can load your own. We talked about and other local tools. We can configure our own in here and have access to all the models that are available. And at that point, it's really picking the best one for the job, which is tough because it always changes. So I would say maybe do some research online based on the role that you're playing and the problem that you're trying to solve. Some agents are better at math than others. Some agents are better at long context windows. We see most of them are 139. Some of them, like Google, does really well. And in this case, GPT has a lot more text, and that's what context window and context size it. It can take a lot more text into account. And you can see if they can call tools or if they can visually understand input. Because we've talked a
Right.
lot about text, but you can give a PDF, you can give a JPEG or an image, and most of these models understand that as well. So that's a typical flow. Now, if I was to show maybe what a multi-agent interaction might look like, this is a simple one. Gave it a simple prompt. This one I think was a test one, so ignore what it really says here, but it's just imagine an initial prompt. In this case, it started a server to interact with web search, and then it tried to do something else on GitHub by calling a tool, and then it spit out the response, right? In this case, VS Code will give me all the changes that were made, and I can choose to accept those changes. I can view the difference between the previous version and the next and take it from there. And there's just to maybe conscious of time over time, and I'll show you a quick sneak peek at, I guess, at this project. Shouldn't be too much of a big deal for me to show this one. This is a representation of this is a tool that I've started to use more often than not called OpenCode. OpenCode is a lot more powerful than VS Code. So you'll see here, OpenCode does a really good job of planning. So you'll see these to-do items, you'll see these subroutines that get called. So in this case, this is a sub-agent that was doing some additional work. This sub-agent is called Explore. So the main agent decided that it needed to explore something further, explore a piece of code, explore some additional information. So it went into its own separate workflow, did its thing, but instead of that response coming back to me as a user, it went back to the original LLM or the original agent to continue processing. And this is how you go through more complex tasks. So you do planning, you do execution, and then you go through that loop over. And we keep talking about context windows and stuff. You can see the context management as an example up here, where in this case I'm using 54,000 tokens, and that's 27% of my context. So what happens, and I'm working through some issues on this project, but what happens is when that context gets too large, you get what's called, in this case, compaction, but it's really just a fancy way of saying summarization. So OpenCode does really good summarization. So that's one of the things that I think it excels at compared to VS Code and Copilot native. So it takes all your messages from before, compacts that into one single prompt that is really a compression of past experiences, right? So think about that as today you're working on your own memory and what you've done today. At some point your day is done, or you've become exhausted and you just can't hold anymore in your head. Your brain summarizes everything and you remember the key points and you forget some stuff. Hopefully you don't forget anything important, but that's where, that compaction becomes useful. And then when it starts again, it picks up from this point of summarization and it drops all the messages before and can continue working from there. And then you can get interactive, right? So we talked about security earlier. So I have these security questions that come up where it'll prompt me and ask me if it's allowed to interact with these files, or is it allowed to run this command on my computer?
Man, I'm going to really enjoy. I've been using mostly the visual. I've been mostly using VS Code, and I still have it on my list, even though I know folks like Jovan and others are doing much more of the nuts and bolts work there. I'm also just looking forward to getting into it to keep my own context up to date. But I'll say that from a tools perspective, what I've heard of both OpenCode and what my experience with VS Code, these are some of the biggest values for the dollar that we have available to us right now. But it also occurs to me that there's something that's really super important. It's that just like it was, some things stay the same. Something stayed the same in that when I was putting together software teams, it's what are these pieces that I'm going to put together and what's in their head and how do I organize them? And it seems to me, Jovan, as we get ready to wrap up, that it's still really important, even if you're dealing with open code and these multi-agent situations, that you think deeply through the how do I set it up and what context does it need to have and how are these pieces going to work together before I hit that button to say go and create something for me. And then what points do I need to be in the loop to check what's happening? That these are some of the most critical points. Why don't you summarize for us a little bit and tell us where should the people who are just getting started off with these kind of multi-agent workflows, what would you tell them to start? And then where can they get some more help? And that's about it.
Yeah, no problem. So I think where to start, I would say for my non-software engineers, start with Claude Code. They're and Claude Desktop. They do a really good job of making it accessible and a really powerful system accessible. Cursor does a good job as well, but Cursor is a extension of VS Code, so definitely on the coding side. Now, as you get more technical, work your way, for me at least, work your way through Copilot, VS Code Copilot or Cursor, and really OpenCode. I've loved the experience. It's not for the faint of heart because you're dealing with a lot more text terminal type output. And then find your model sweet spot, right? Find the models that work for you. So in this case, I use a lot of Sonnet. So Sonnet for most basic, most general purpose things, and then Claude Opus, which is a lot more powerful, but from a usage and cost benefit perspective, it's 3 times more expensive than Sonnet. So you can get Opus Fast, which I think is 30 times more expensive. So we have to take cost into account. So find a model that works for you. And for the problems that you're trying to solve, it doesn't have to be a paid one. You can see a bunch of these free. Quen is a good free one. If you don't have the hardware to run it, I would say Copilot gives you a bunch of them for free that you can use, or at least I should say OpenCode gives you a couple that you could use for free. Min-Max is really good. Min-Max and Quen are some of the top open source models. So start with experimenting with those for what you're trying to do. And then if you're trying to run locally, you need the hardware. Mac Pros are getting up there. I think they'll be the solution for sovereign AI for the most part. So experiment with those and questions. Always happy to field questions if anybody wants to reach out, no problem. Other than that, Anthropic puts out good papers. The internet and news sites are abuzz with anything AI. So information is not a shortage. It's find the questions or find the sources that you trust. Google AI mode is helpful to me. I go to that a lot more than just Google search nowadays. I don't want to pay for tokens. That's a good hack. You use AI mode on Google and you get Gemini for the most part with web search. So that's pretty helpful.
Folks, I think we're going to call it there. If you have any questions before we wrap it up, we're almost 10 minutes over. I would love to see At least love to see your hands up, but absolutely do reach out to us at the DX Alliance. So that's info@dxalliance.org, or you can hit up Jovan at jovan@dxalliance.org as well. And especially if we put this out in replay and you're thinking about re-engineering your software development lifecycle, you want somebody that's going to help you to rethink how do you create your team, how do you get the most value out of it when you're getting into your new project. I would say do not enter into any new software projects without considering how you leverage this, and not just on your side, but perhaps how your vendor is leveraging that. Because if your vendors are not using, and I will say as somebody who's sold code for a while, all right, now, the economics of code in 2026 is not the same as the economics of code in 2025. So if your vendor still has the same process in mind, they're not thinking the right way right now. So you need to get a hold of us. And even if you're not going to use any of the DX Alliance things, I'm sure Jovan, myself, would be happy to talk with you about how you're putting together your project, how you're assessing the things that are coming to you from your vendors. We'd love to have a look at that. And if you're thinking about your own internal team and how to make them 2026 ready, have a chat with us on that front as well. But before we get going, I'm going to have a last call for a couple questions for those of you who might want to have a question or a comment. Going once.
Does
Going twice.
Jovan
Yes, go ahead.
ever close his browser?
Never. That's why I said, that's what I said.
Oh.
That's why I said, oh my God, when I saw his tabs too.
David, that being said, my favorite feature, especially in Safari, is tab groups, because that was just the tabs for one project. I
Oh
have
my gosh.
one for every one tab group for every. I think I had 800 tabs at one point on one browser session.
Jovan needs an LLM just to get through his tabs. He's going to like, where's that tab again?
Yeah, sometimes I just have to say screw it and close the window and kind of start from scratch again. But tab groups are helpful.
Talk about context window, brother.
Yeah,
oh my gosh. Yours is huge already. All right, folks, I'm going to call it there, and we'll post this on the DX Alliance website. If you missed last week, it's up there right now on the blog. This will be on the blog next week. And I hope soon that we're going to be speaking with another new member of our team about some financial compliance stuff, some very important financial compliance developments right here in Dominica in the credit union space. And I think it's something that we should be looking out for throughout the region as well. So look out for that. Look out for me in my other role as on the Caribbean Digital Finance Alliance, where we have some interesting things coming up on that front as well. But until then, Jovan, thank you so much for letting us have a little bit of a look under the scenes. And everybody, thanks for coming up and keep showing up for each other.
Yeah, appreciate everybody coming out and the questions. Appreciate it.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Stop recording.